Thank you so much. I am taking in and digesting, metabolizing all that has been offered so much this morning and all that has required of us to make this moment possible. So I'm going to take a deep breath and invite you again to sip in some deep breathing. Whatever you might need, we've been sitting for quite a while. If you need to stand up and move as you listen, I also want to invite that. I'll be sharing a bit of our moving through grief work as a project and our effort to make space for us, those working in schools, to befriend our strong emotions and experience through loss. And I just have to say personally, it wasn't until I joined this project as an educator for 17 years did I really notice how raw my own personal grief was. Until I was allowed to sit in space to acknowledge it with others, did I notice the wounds within me that were still raw and the wounds within me that have healed over and created really hard, tough scar tissue. And just a bit of my own personal experience in engaging in this type of conversation. I'm hoping to offer some of our framing, some questions that we may consider when thinking about how to intentionally create space for grief within schools. I've heard it be shared that in order to heal, we must feel. Right? And we're working within systems that often move far too fast to feel. They're designed in ways that don't allow for feeling. So this is really a shift. And in this moment, I invite us to think creatively about ways we might acknowledge and move through our strong emotions that have surfaced as a result of student loss, as a result of distance, goodbyes, pauses in connection and relationship as well, for our own wellness and healing, and also so that we may model for our young people what versions of wholeness might look like and feel like and sound like. We have this incredible opportunity to support a new way of being as they grow into adulthood. This is a new way of being, and also a re-remembering. I've heard that term recently, re-remembering of what has been stolen from us through the process of colonization, white supremacy, historically, and on a daily basis, ways that we are stripped of our humanity and our ability to connect with what it is we are feeling and experiencing. So I'm going to start with this very basic reminder, these words, that we're wading through systems that function off of our fractioning, and in so many regards require us to think of our needs last. And I don't know about y'all, but for me, I never get to my to-do list. I never get to what's at the bottom. So if I'm last, I'm not even acknowledging what's at the bottom sometimes, except for the 3 a.m. ruminations. So the first step in sustaining ourselves as teachers is recognizing that professional norms regulate our grieving and our emotions surrounding loss. I want to say that also because we are taught to and conditioned to blame ourselves for our inability to access wellness. And I just want to state here that we are working in reaction or response to systems and structures. And so if we are not able to process our grief, we absolutely have a responsibility to do it, but must acknowledge that there's so many forces working against it. So we all here in this room, right, and as a project have learned a lot about grief just in the process of sitting with it. We know that time does not heal all wounds. We know that grief comes in waves. It surfaces in moments that we don't intend for it to always. That everything and anything can spark an association with it, that it won't wait to be noticed, and that it must be tended to in order to be processed. I ask you to consider what happens when we deny ourselves the space to heal. What does that mean for us in our healing process when we deny ourselves the space to feel, when we put it at the bottom of our list, or we gloss over it or jump over it in many ways. And I would love to hear your thoughts to that question, as I'm also thinking about what happens to us internally, psychologically, emotionally, what happens to us as ecosystems, as within our relationships and our communities, when we're not allowed the opportunity to heal. Absolutely. We're constantly on edge. We're operating from a hyper aroused nervous system, for sure. We can feel mad, drained, resentful, right? We can not understand where in which our emotions are coming from, disconnected. We could hold on to coping mechanisms that don't necessarily serve us in this moment, or develop coping mechanisms that have ramifications that could impact us negatively as well. Going numb, unattended grief, the root of burnout. Yes, our bodies develop physical pain and tension, for sure, right? Our body is the first indicator of something awry, and oftentimes it is manifested as illness or dis-ease, uncomfort. Right. So within schools, grief is often unnamed, unacknowledged. Right. And we want to uplift this idea of disenfranchised grief. There's so many types of grief, right? There's big G grief, which is in relation to death, loss of life. There's little grief, moving, no longer having access to something that was significant to you. There's disenfranchised grief, which is a grief in which we have no space to name or voice our experience through it, no permission to actually feel. And then parts of us become truncated or silenced. And then we have that rawness of our wounds, or that scarring over in a manner that can be thick and hard to penetrate. We, as a project, started to hold life after loss tables. And I'm going to begin to talk about these tables and that experience just a bit. And I want to uplift Beverly's words, who was an integral member of our community that supported us in shaping the tables through her participation in a pilot table. And she really speaks to, in this quote here and in her experience, if you were to be in conversation with her, how invisible she felt in her grief, and how that shaped her own perception around what was worthy of even feeling. Right. And so she was responding in relation to her community, and this inability to speak it really caused some tremendous suffering for her. And I'm sure many of us can relate. And so we began to host, through her participation in supporting the creation of it, and the dinner party, which is an incredible partner of ours, these life after loss tables where educators could come and gather as they are and speak to the experience they were wading through in relation to student loss. Not immediate student loss necessarily, though that is absolutely occurring for us, but a year, 6 months, 3 years later, how is that loss you experience shaping your concept of self, your own ability to access wellness and joy, your relationship with others, your pedagogy, your practice? So these 3 questions really guided our work, and they are alive for us in many regards. How might the experience of student death years ago impact your current practice? And as they're projected on the screen, as I read them, I invite you to think about it reflectively for yourself. How might we make sense of school-based loss, and how might that inform who we are as administrators, as educators, clinicians, advocates, school partners? And how might we incorporate the losses we experienced as students ourselves, now that we are educators, perhaps even in the same community we grew up in? And this was very much my experience. I, as a young person growing up in San Francisco, experienced multiple loss to community violence, to incarceration, to gentrification, to death by suicide. And then as a teacher, as a school leader and administrator, as a therapist, meeting the young people in my presence with incredible urgency, with fear, with all of these emotions that have been unprocessed as a result of my coming up. And I was asking them what I found in reflection to hold those with me, those emotions with me, before I had processed them myself. So we know that student death can have immediate and long-term impact on the ways in which we intentionally or unintentionally build culture in a school, the ways in which we approach our own practice, and our capacity to feel and see in the moment. Right? Rachel Rahman, I believe, says that often we are so bombarded by loss that we are holding loss so fully that we have no room left to feel joy or other things that might also in this moment be present for us. And how might that shape our experience in the work if we could hold the multitude rather than just the heaviness? These words have brought me incredible hope in thinking about our task as those that hold space for others, and thinking about my own experience with loss and someone committed to healing and a healing journey. I'm going to read them out loud, and I invite you to read them as well yourself as I read out loud. Individual psychology can heal by finding the courses of action that match one's felt need. But there's no skip steps. Sitting with discomfort is always first, followed by connection and inspiration. But at the end of the day, we need action to metabolize grief and transform our material and cultural conditions. Metabolized grief can power deep and lasting change infused with profound joy, while unmetabolized grief becomes an almost insurmountable barrier to it. Invite you to notice which of those words are maybe reverberating for you as I read them, as you read them yourself. Which words on this page do you find your eyes gravitating towards? As a project, our hope really was to support educators in moving through, right? When sharing these words, we invite you to think about which of these words are standing out to you the most in this moment. And if you could drop those in the chat. Sitting with discomfort. How do you go sit down? The realest question. Yes. I invite you to find the chat and drop into the chat the maybe 3 to 5 words, consecutive words that are resonating with you. Grief can power deep and lasting change. Need action to metabolize grief. Action to metabolize grief. Metabolize grief powers deep and lasting change, profounded by joy. Infused with profound joy. What are these words making you think and wonder? Not the totality of this quote, but the 3 to 5 words that are resonating with you. What are those words? What is that string of words making you wonder, making you think, making you feel? Sitting with discomfort is the most difficult task of all time, but it resonates as the most important step of grieving. Embracing discomfort can be your state of growth at times, can become, yes, absolutely, connection and inspiration, insurmountable barrier. Makes me think the same as question 4. What can I do about it? Yes. Yes. Emotional laxative. That is fantastic. Thanks for the smile. Right. And so we want to continue to dream and explore what is challenging about this and what might we do about this, about the challenges that arise when thinking about metabolizing grief and about overcoming or climbing above and beyond the surmountable barriers, right? To feeling, to joy, to healing that could exist within our school spaces. I'm going to drop into the chat board. And Jamboard is a tool that some of us may be familiar with, some of us may be acknowledging or connecting with for the very first time. In responding to this question, what's challenging about metabolizing strong emotions in the context of schools? And thinking about what we might do about it. Some of us are conditioned to jump to the solution. And so there's space for us to get there, but no fast steps. Thinking about the challenges absolutely support us in developing solutions that are attuned to the problem and that are responsive. And so on the left-hand side of your toolbar, it's called a sticky note. So if you hover over the toolbar, you'll see sticky note, and you can click on that and begin to respond to these 2 questions. And we'll take about 3 quick minutes to do. What feels challenging to you in your experience, in your setting, in your body, in your heart, in your nervous system, in regards to metabolizing strong emotions in the context of schools? I'm just allowing a quiet moment, and in a second, I'll begin to read some of what I see. Mm. I see a lot of echoing in regards to time, lack of time, expectation of productivity, being stifled by that or pressured by that, meeting state standards, conversations about grief or strong emotions or full humanity being considered inappropriate for school spaces. That's a tremendous barrier to push through, to overcome, to break down. Administration that considers tears an expression of emotion as unprofessional. Mm. My journey towards this work started with me first asking my young folks to be honest, to be vulnerable, to share their stories. And then at a certain point, I realized how irresponsible that was of me. to require that without doing my own personal work, without engaging in vulnerability, trust building, sharing of our stories as staff and adults. And so it really not surprised to see that administration still views heart-centered work and our emotional fullness as inappropriate. It does sadden me. The business as usual attitude, right? After something has happened. What does that stem from? We wonder, right? Why do people jump to business as usual? We've been talking as a project a lot about the fear and unknowing of how to wade through something. So then we just push through because we do know how to do that. Lack of time being echoed. The politicized nature of our schools these days. Constant feeling of walking on eggshells and having to hide my true emotions when parents and others are creating these feelings. Right. What might we do about this? Are there glimmers of experience or hope you've engaged in already this morning that you might call into the right-hand section of this Jamboard? What might we do about the time challenges, about the building a culture that allows for honesty and vulnerability and sharing of our strong emotions? And that's a heavy question to sit with. Yes, sign up for opportunities like this. Absolutely. Radical acceptance while finding the wiggle room for change. Yes, the wiggle room. I love that. Sean Wright also speaks to not necessarily large steps, leaps and bounds, but pivots, right? Small steps in a different direction. That 10 steps from now might lead us to a completely new place, starting with ourselves. Absolutely. Finding your people, for sure. I've worked in so many different school environments. The ones that felt most sustainable were the ones that I had comrades. I was in solidarity with folks. We were connecting on every level that you could imagine in building meaningful, working, and just human connection. And that gave me the energy to power through and forge change, to take these steps and these pivots. Modeling acceptance, checking your own discomfort and allowing space for that to rest instead of cutting short the work. Beautiful. If at any point in the day or over the night, more ideas come to you around how we might interrupt what it is we're experiencing, the barriers to metabolization of our strong emotions and grief, please record them here in this Jamboard. It's huge to think of how we might challenge a system that does not support our full humanity. It absolutely does courageously, bravely, lovingly start with ourselves. These tables that we offered last year and will continue to offer in different iterations really served as an opportunity for that, to start with self and to create some compassionate witnessing for our experience in the loss that we are wading through. No one is free from this loss, sadly. I want to give the opportunity to unmute if anyone feels called to share. I see 2 hands up.
Good morning, buenos dias. I work with San Francisco. Thank you for this. I love this. When I saw this institute, I was like, we should have had this a long time ago. I've been in education, it's going to be my 17th year. So I really appreciate you having the leaders and all the teachers and the healers who's here and doing this. I really appreciate you doing this so much. My question is, So grieving is just a very complex concept, and also like practice that we experience, right? So I put in the chat that I work with a lot of BIPOC families that tell me like, I don't have time to grieve because I'm trying to survive and I'm putting food on the table, trying to get my kids at your school, at the school, because they don't want any ramifications because if you're late or tardy or absent, there is a process to it, right? So, including my own family, when I was getting raised too as an immigrant, Pinay woman to my strong, beautiful mom. So, I guess my question is like, how do you respond to that? Right. When grief is so deeply buried in like our psyche, right? But they're like trying to survive in this white supremacy and capitalist world that doesn't really embrace them in all the working fields that our mothers and our families work in.
Thank you for that question. I have heard it and I have asked it myself. Absolutely. And a few things come to mind. One is as we're engaged in our own healing and grieving process, as we're maybe with a little more resource able to engage in that process, we know firsthand the transformation and the healing that can come with sitting in that, with sitting with our strong emotions and our experience with grief. And so having our own lived experience in choosing bravely and against many barrier healing as opposed to just pushing through, I think is one way that we can speak to our families from that space. And then also, yeah, we are working hard to get by, and there are other ways of being, right? I learned about the GET strategies as a young organizer myself. There's getting by, getting through, getting over, right? And really in getting together is where we create healing and transformation. And so then I wonder, as a school, how can we create these spaces, right? That if it's not in a gathering that 20 or 30 folks come to, in my 5-minute interaction with a family, how can I slow down and create space for their humanity and what they're holding? So I think there's a range of ways in which we can begin to hold this space and create this space for our families. And it doesn't have to be in grand events or long-term communities of practice, but just in the 5 minutes, right? Making eye contact, slowing down, thanking them for the ways in which they've showed up in this moment, in this day, and acknowledging that they're doing the absolute best they can to survive and to make it through, I think can be baby steps or shifts towards this. And if anyone else has ideas, we'd love to see it in the chat. I see one more hand up and then we'll move on.
Good afternoon. Thank you all for this. This was more needed than I realized. And my main question, I had actually was dropping in the chat for the sake of time, is how do we deal with the residue of grief and painful emotions from others while also trying to navigate metabolizing our own personal grief? Because my issue has been, I am so empathetic with my students, but you're talking about, I started in education in 2001. I have chosen to work in non-traditional, quote unquote, alternative school environments. That's a lot of pain that I'm helping students navigate while also having my own things. It becomes a lot. And the reality is my professional practice suffered because I was so dialed into trying to make sure that my students were okay.
Thank you for that question. I see in the chat, there's multiple folks that are sitting with that question, right? I hope that folks can continue to come to these spaces and to their offerings that we have throughout the school year, because I think there will be opportunity for us to witness with you and to hold with you what it is you are experiencing. That's huge, is not holding it alone. acknowledging that some days you can show up for it and some days you can't. So sizing your expectation of yourself, I think, is huge. And for me, one thing that has been really important is building my network of care for my young people and understanding that I am not equipped, nor do I have the time or energy to be everything and all things to them. And so who can we partner with to hold their wellness with us? I saw in the chat earlier, someone said, find your people. That is huge in finding the people that can support you outside of the work, but also within the work can hold your young folks with you. And that leads beautifully into my next slide. I want to say, please continue to hold these questions. We're going to engage in a beautiful art practice coming up. And then after that, we're going to have conversation time for us to knock down the slides, have our voices come front and center, and really surface the questions that we're grappling with. And continue to respond if folks have ideas in the chat. Please use the chat. So we're going to bring these two questions into the latter part of our day. So I want to say that. And then also say this: what supports us in metabolizing our strong emotions? It's opportunities to be fully witnessed, right? So how are we witnessing our families in their efforts to make it to school each day, in their efforts to provide stability, love, warmth, and care for their young folks? Right? How are you creating opportunities for yourself to be witnessed in your practice and outside of the work? I think these are, again, a lot of questions we come with, right? And there's some richness in sitting with these questions. Safe and brave spaces in which to name our feelings and experiences. How are we using our one-on-one interactions, our relationships with colleagues, our small teams, our professional development time to serve as this space to name our feelings in this work and what we're holding? And then how are we building the skill within each person that exists within our school systems to mirror, to accept and normalize what surfaces when we are brave enough to share what it is we're feeling without judgment, knowing that grief does not have its own timeline, that it surfaces or manifests for folks in a variety of ways, and often ways that are hard to hold, hard to bear witness to. And we think keeping these ideas in mind are really important when making space for your own grief and making space for the grief of others. One thing that is so important, I think, connecting to what Candace shared and what Jen shared earlier, is knowing when you have the resource to do this. And so we have here, and you'll get a copy of this, it's on our website already, but some questions to consider about your own resource and capability in the moment to share parts of your grief and your grief journey. Right? It's not always safe to do. So how do we create those conditions, and how do we know within ourselves what our boundaries are for sharing? And so gonna dive into this also in future communities of practice and webinars, events that we're offering in the fall, but just wanted to provide that there. And some commitments that we hope we can lean into as we think about making space for the metabolization of our grief. This is that we commit to educate ourselves, stay informed. That's our personal awareness and awareness of our community's needs as well. And so awareness is noticing, attuning is like, so what does that need from me? And so sharing that in what we mean by informed, that we establish, communicate, negotiate, and respect boundaries when we need to have them. Our own personal boundaries, our ability for our young folks to assert their own boundaries is incredibly important. We think about trauma-informed practices, voice and choice is paramount there. And so how are we creating space for the establishment and the assertion of our own boundaries and the boundaries of others? That we are attuned to the experience of grief and lived experiences, and how can we make our grief response, recovery, and renewal needs different, adhering to the uniqueness of our own journeys and our own experiences and our own needs. And so in thinking about how you might honor the grief that young folks, their families, yourself might be carrying into this school year. What other commitments might we need to uplift? If those come to you, we'd love to see them in the chat. How do these resonate with you? What do you wonder about them? And what might you add to them? I was going to lead us through an embodiment practice that we don't have time for fully, but I will invite us for a minute to maybe disconnect from the screen and the words and move our intention, if accessible, into our own bodies. Thinking about the culmination of moments we've already shared together. It's 11:08 here in Oakland, California. Some of us joined at 9. Some of us joined at 8:30. Thinking about how these words are landing in your body. Thinking about how grief might be landing in your body, where it might live. The next 30 seconds, if accessible to you, I invite you to close your eyes and bring awareness to your toes. Just noticing, no judgment, no need to change or alter. Just noticing. Bring your awareness from your toes, through your feet, up your ankles and your calves. Just noticing, scanning, bearing witness. Bearing witness to the experience of your knees, your thighs, your sit bone. Bringing awareness up through your chest, your shoulders, your neck. And breathing in deeply, the experience of your entire body. What are you feeling? What are you noticing? What is needed from you? Your eyes are closed, you can open them, raise your gaze. If there's any source of natural light in the room you're sitting in, I invite you to find it. You look towards the door, back to the screen. In the chat, what did you notice? And when you imagine what life could feel like after metabolizing grief, or through the metabolization of grief, what comes up? What words, what images, what shapes, what feelings, sensations? Acceptance, calm, freedom, peace, joy, peace, lightness, wholeness. Still, as we're limboing from the inward to the space here, I invite you to sit these words in. Allow these words to land in your body, in your heart. Validation, peace, connection, vitality, forward moving energy. Thank you. Thank you for sitting with me as I shared a bit of our life after loss work, and as we imagined what holding space for our fullness and for our grief could do for us as individuals, but also do for our practice in our school community. I'm going to hand it back over to Leora. Thank you.